Late 1944. The border between Belgium and Germany. By September, the Allied armies were drunk on victory. They had liberated Paris. They had swept across France. They believed the German Wehrmacht was broken. Soldiers wrote home, promising they would be back by Christmas. But on the map, between them and the Rhine River, lay a dark patch of green. 50 square miles of ancient pine and fir, the Hürtgen Forest. It was a place where the sun rarely touched the ground. The trees grew so close together that a man could barely squeeze between them. The floor was a tangle of roots, ravines, and freezing mud. It was terrain that negated every advantage the American army possessed. Tanks could not move. Airplanes could not see targets. Artillery shells burst in the treetops, showering the ground with wood splinters sharper than steel. It was a fortress designed by nature, and the American command decided to walk straight into it. The decision belonged to Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army. Hodges was a man of the old school. He believed in aggression. He looked at the map and saw a forest. He did not see a trap. He ordered the 9th Infantry Division to clear the woods. The men who stepped into that tree line were not elite commandos. They were replacements, draftees, clerks turned into riflemen. Many of them had never fired a weapon in anger. They were young, barely 20 years old. They carried heavy winter coats, M1 Garands, and a belief that the war was almost over. They did not know that the Germans had been preparing this forest for months. They did not know about the bunkers camouflaged as log piles. They did not know about the shoe mines, wooden boxes of explosives that metal detectors could not find. They walked into the shadow of the trees, and the forest swallowed them. The fighting began not as a battle, but as a disappearance. Patrols went out and did not return. The density of the forest meant that radio signals failed. Compasses spun wildly due to iron deposits in the rock. Units got lost 100 yards from their own lines. And then the shelling started. The Germans didn't need to see the Americans. They had pre-sighted every trail intersection. When the shells hit the tree canopy, the result was horrific. Veterans later called it the death factory. A soldier didn't have to be hit by shrapnel to die. The concussion alone, trapped in the ravines, could liquefy organs. The trees, shattered by explosions, fell on the men like giant hammers. Within days, the 9th Division was combat ineffective. They lost 4,500 men in less than 2 weeks. Instead of withdrawing, General Hodges doubled down. He sent in the 28th Division, then the 4th, then the 8th. He fed division after division into the wood chipper. He was trading American lives for yards of useless ground. Why? Why did they keep attacking? Strategists today agree the forest could have been bypassed. The Americans could have simply surrounded it and starved the Germans out. But the commanders were obsessed with momentum. They were obsessed with the broad front strategy. They ignored the intelligence reports about the dams on the Ruhr River, the real strategic objective that lay behind the forest. Instead, they focused on the trees. For the common soldier, the strategy didn't matter. Life shrank to the size of a foxhole. It rained every day. The mud was knee-deep. Trench foot became an epidemic. Men stood in freezing water for days, unable to light fires, unable to sleep, waiting for the snap of a twig that meant death was coming. The silence of the forest was worse than the noise. In the silence, you could hear the wounded calling for their mothers in the darkness of no man's land. And you couldn't go help them because the snipers were waiting.
November 2nd, 1944. All Souls Day.
The commanders picked a new objective, the town of Schmidt. To get there, the 28th Infantry Division had to cross a deep ravine via a single, narrow dirt track, the Kahl Trail. It was barely wide enough for a cart. It was steep, slick with ice, and dropped off into a dark gorge, and the generals ordered the tanks to cross it. The Sherman tanks moved out in the freezing rain. The drivers were terrified. They couldn't see the edge. The ground crumbled under the 30-ton weight of the machines. Then the inevitable happened. The lead tank hit a patch of loose shale. It slipped. It threw a track. Within minutes, the narrow trail was blocked. The tanks couldn't move forward. They couldn't turn back. They were steel coffins trapped on a ledge. The infantry had to go on alone, without armor, without supplies. They walked down into the gorge, leaving their protection behind. The Germans waited until the Americans were deep in the valley. Then they attacked. They knew the terrain perfectly. They had registered their mortars on the trail. The 112th Infantry Regiment found themselves in a slaughterhouse. German panzers appeared on the high ground. Since the American tanks were stuck on the trail, the infantry had nothing to fight back with. Panic set in. Command and control broke down. Officers were killed by snipers. Radios were destroyed. Men fought small, lonely battles in the mist. Some units simply vanished. They were never seen again. It was one of the worst tactical disasters of the European war. And yet, amidst the butchery, something strange happened. November 7th, the bridge across the Kahl River. The wounded were piling up. There were too many of them. American medics were overwhelmed. They ran out of bandages. They ran out of morphine. The German regimental doctor, a man named Günther Stütgen, saw the American wounded lying in the freezing mud. He made a decision that defied the logic of total war. He ordered his men to hold fire. He walked out into no man's land with a Red Cross flag. For a few hours, the war stopped. German medics and American medics worked side by side. They shared cigarettes. They shared cognac. They treated men who, an hour earlier, had been trying to kill each other. Dr. Stütgen treated an American soldier with a shattered leg. Why? The American asked him. The German doctor didn't speak English. He just pointed to the Red Cross on his arm. Humanity had briefly returned to the forest. But truces do not last. Among the soldiers shivering in the mud was a man who did not have to be there. Ernest Hemingway. The famous writer was covering the war for Collier's magazine. He had seen war before, in Italy, in Spain. But the Hürtgen Forest broke him. He walked through the shattered tree lines. He saw the frozen bodies stacked like cordwood to clear the roads. He wrote that it was Passchendaele with tree bursts, a reference to the worst senseless slaughter of World War I. Hemingway noted that in other battles, men died like soldiers. In Hurtgen, they died like animals in a trap. He saw officers removing their rank insignia because German snipers targeted anyone who looked like a leader. In the Hurtgen, there were no leaders, only survivors. November 23, 1944, Thanksgiving Day. General Hodges wanted a victory for the newspapers. He couldn't give them a military victory, so he decided to give them a morale victory. He ordered that every man on the front line be served a hot turkey dinner with all the trimmings. It was a logistical nightmare. Jeeps carrying hot containers drove down the muddy fire breaks. The Germans saw the movement. They opened fire with mortars. Men died trying to deliver cranberry sauce. Men died trying to crawl back to their holes with a mess tin. And for those who got the food, it was a cruel joke. Lieutenant Paul Bosch, a machine gun platoon leader, looked at the turkey on his plate. He looked at the unburied bodies of his friends just 10 yards away. The smell of death was so strong that the men couldn't eat. They threw the turkey into the mud. The morale boost became a reminder of how disconnected the generals were from the reality of the forest. By mid-December, the forest had changed. It was no longer a forest. The artillery had sheared off every tree at a height of 20 feet. The landscape looked like the surface of the moon, covered in splintered stumps and craters. The ground was a slurry of mud, ice, and human remains. The Americans had advanced maybe 3 miles. They had paid for every yard with a life. And the dams, the strategic objective they were supposed to capture, were still in German hands. General Hodges finally paused the offensive, not because he wanted to, but because on December 16, a new sound was heard in the distance, the rumble of hundreds of German tanks gathering in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and the men who had survived the meat grinder were about to be thrown into the fire again.
December 16, 1944. The Germans launched the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Overnight, the Hürtgen Forest lost its strategic importance. The Allied armies pivoted south to stop the German breakthrough. The troops were pulled out of the green hell. They left behind a landscape that had been chewed to pieces, and they left behind their dead. When the snow melted in the spring of 1945, the true cost of General Hodges' obsession was revealed. The casualty count was staggering. 33,000 American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. To put that in perspective, that is more than the Marines lost at Tarawa and Iwo Jima combined. And what did they gain? A few miles of pine trees. The Roer dams, the objective of the entire campaign, were still in German hands. They weren't captured until February. The battle was a strategic failure, a stalemate bought with blood. But you won't find many movies about the Hürtgen Forest. You won't find it celebrated in history books like D-Day or the Bulge. Why? Because generals write history, and generals do not like to write about their mistakes. Dwight Eisenhower wrote extensive memoirs about his victories. He devoted less than 1 page to the Hürtgen Forest. Courtney Hodges, the man responsible, was never fired. He finished the war as a hero. The battle was buried under the rug. It was an embarrassment, a reminder that sometimes the good guys make terrible decisions. But the men who fought there, they couldn't forget. For the rest of their lives, veterans of the 4th, 9th, and 28th Divisions would wake up screaming at the sound of a tree branch snapping in the wind. Today, the trees have grown back. The Hürtgen Forest is green again. Hikers walk the trails where tanks once burned, but the earth remembers. Every year the ground frost pushes something to the surface, a rusted belt buckle, an unexploded shell, a piece of bone. The missing in action recovery teams are still working there. 80 years later, they are still finding American soldiers curled up in their foxholes, waiting for the order to retreat that never came. They are finally going home, one by one. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest teaches us a hard lesson. It teaches us that bravery is not enough, that blind obedience can lead to disaster, and that the most dangerous thing on a battlefield isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's a map in a warm tent and a general who refuses to admit he is wrong. To the men of the Bloody Bucket, the Ivy Division, and the Old Reliables, we remember you. You did your duty in the dark. Stories like this were almost lost. Thank you for taking the time to remember them with us.